In the days following the storm, Sunny Meadows buzzed with activity. Insurance adjusters in khakis and polo shirts roamed the neighborhood, clipboards in hand. Emergency management crews cleared debris from streets. Neighbors helped each other pump out basements and drag waterlogged furniture to curbs. Thomas spent his morning helping the elderly Johnsons clean their flooded garage, carefully avoiding any mention of Patricia's shed. When asked, he simply shrugged and said, "Nature can be unpredictable." The emergency HOA meeting was held at the community center, which had been converted into a temporary relief station. Red Cross volunteers served coffee at the back, while board member Eliza Chen called the meeting to order. Patricia sat in the front row, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her normally perfect hair showing signs of hasty styling. When she'd attempted to take her usual position at the head table, Eliza had firmly directed her to the audience seating. Given recent events, Eliza began, the board has called this emergency session to address several urgent matters, including flood damage assessment and allegations of mismanagement. Patricia surged to her feet. "This is absurd. I lost valuable HOA property in the flood. Thomas Mitchell sabotaged the shed, and I demand immediate action." Thomas calmly raised his hand. Eliza nodded to him. "I have evidence proving I never touched the shed," he said, connecting his laptop to the projector. The security footage played, showing the shed's slow surrender to the rising waters. "You'll notice," Thomas continued, "that I'm clearly visible through my front window during the entire event, drinking hot chocolate and reading a book." He switched to the second camera angle, showing his front door remaining closed all night. Patricia wasn't deterred. He removed the anchoring stakes. The shed was perfectly secure before the storm. "Interesting you should mention that," Michael Rivera said, stepping forward with official-looking documents. The county inspection revealed the shed never had proper anchoring to begin with. It was installed on temporary blocks without permanent footings, in direct violation of building codes. Additionally, it was placed within the designated flood boundary, which is why it was so vulnerable. "And about those anchoring stakes," added Mrs. Johnson, "I have 7 witnesses who saw Pinnacle Landscapes leave without installing them properly. They were in quite a hurry to finish before Thomas returned from his business trip." Patricia's face contorted with fury. "This is a conspiracy, I demand." "Actually," interrupted Fred, his voice stronger than anyone could remember hearing it, "what I want to know is why HOA funds were used to purchase 4 new lawn mowers that no one ever saw, plus patio furniture that somehow ended up in that shed." The room fell silent. "The truth is," Eliza said quietly, "we've completed a preliminary audit of the HOA accounts. We've found numerous irregularities that we've been obligated to report to the authorities." Patricia's face drained of color. "You had no right to access those accounts without my authorization." "As treasurer, I have every right," Mrs. Johnson corrected. "And as 3 board members, we had the authority to request the audit without your approval." Thomas watched as Patricia seemed to physically deflate, the realization dawning that her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling. She grabbed her designer purse and stood. "This isn't over," she hissed, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Actually," Thomas said softly, "I think it is." As Patricia stormed toward the exit, Marcus called out, "Meeting's not adjourned, Patricia. We still need to vote on restoring Thomas's fence." She didn't look back, the door slamming behind her with a finality that felt symbolic to everyone present. The vote was unanimous. By week's end, Thomas's fence was back in its original position, his view of the creek restored. The garden he replanted thrived in the nutrient-rich soil left behind by the floodwaters. And on quiet evenings, when Thomas sat in his hammock, watching the sunset reflect off the creek's gentle surface, he would occasionally spot a piece of beige vinyl siding or a weathered board lodged along the bank downstream. Small reminders that nature, karma, and careful planning can be a powerful combination against even the most formidable of HOA tyrants. Thomas tried to ignore Patricia's escalating campaign against his property. He'd nod politely when passing her on his morning runs, hoping that professional courtesy might diffuse the situation. It didn't. "Your trash cans were visible from the street for 20 minutes after collection yesterday," Patricia informed him one Tuesday morning, appearing suddenly beside his mailbox like an apparition in a paisley pantsuit. Section 8.2 clearly states they must be removed within 15 minutes. That's a violation. Thomas took a deep breath. I was on a work call that ran long. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. She handed him a pre-printed violation notice, already filled out with his address. 3 strikes, and it goes to the board for review. That evening, Thomas discovered a small surveyor's flag planted in his backyard, just 6 inches from his fence. When he pulled it out, he found a laminated note attached. Environment Evidence number 1. The following day brought 5 more flags and an official-looking letter demanding he appear before the Violations Committee, which consisted of Patricia, her cousin Debbie, and Fred Simmons, whose dementia was an open neighborhood secret, but who could still reliably follow Patricia's lead with an agreeable nod. This has gone far enough, Thomas muttered, pulling out his home purchase documents. He spent 3 hours digging through paperwork until he found what he needed, the original property survey with the county surveyor's stamp, clearly showing his fence was precisely on the property line, exactly where it should be. Armed with the documentation, Thomas knocked on Patricia's door the next morning. She answered wearing rubber gloves and holding a spray bottle of disinfectant, as if preparing to sanitize whatever he might touch. I've found the original survey, Thomas said, holding up the document. My fence is exactly where it should be. I'm happy to get a new survey done if there's genuine confusion, but the harassment needs to stop. Patricia's eyes narrowed behind her rhinestone-studded glasses. That survey is clearly outdated. The HOA commissioned a new assessment last month that shows the community space extends 6 inches past your current fence. May I see this new survey? Thomas asked. It's being finalized, Patricia said quickly. But as HOA president, I have an obligation to protect community property from encroachment. As Thomas turned to leave, he noticed a stack of violation notices on Patricia's hall table, dozens of them, all blank and ready to be deployed against any neighbor who dared cross her. Next to them sat a book titled HOA President Power, Maximizing Your Authority. That night, Thomas reached out to several neighbors, discovering he wasn't alone in his frustrations. The Rodriguezes had been fined for their ethnic garden ornaments, a ceramic burrow his mother had brought from Mexico. The Patels had received weekly citations about their excessive use of spices, creating non-conforming odors. Even Mrs. Johnson, who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, had been threatened with fines for her bird feeders. She's on a power trip, sighed Mrs. Johnson over her fence. Being like this, since her husband left her for that yoga instructor in Scottsdale, some people don't need much authority before it goes to their heads. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Has anyone ever successfully stood up to her? Mrs. Johnson laughed. The last person who tried came home to find their sprinkler system mysteriously redirected to flood their front door. Patricia called it an act of God. Thomas looked toward Patricia's house, where she could be seen measuring a neighbor's mailbox height with a laser level. Well, he said quietly, maybe it's time someone showed her what happens when you push too far. Following Marcus's revelation about the flood boundary, Thomas spent a rainy Saturday afternoon at the county records office. Buried in a dusty file cabinet, he found the original environmental impact assessment for Sunny Meadows, complete with topographical maps and floodplain designations. This is gold, Thomas muttered, snapping photos of the relevant pages. The assessment clearly marked a 20-foot no-build zone extending from the creek's edge, precisely where Patricia's shed now stood. Armed with this information, Thomas requested an emergency meeting with the full HOA board. Patricia tried to deny the request, but Thomas had already circulated emails to all board members, CCing every homeowner in the development. The meeting was held in the community center's basement. Thomas arrived early, setting up a projector to display the county documents. Patricia strode in 15 minutes late, flanked by Fred and Debbie like henchwomen in a gangster film. Let's make this quick, Patricia said, checking her watch. Some of us have important engagements this evening. Thomas stood, connecting his laptop to the projector. I'll be brief. The shed that was installed after moving my fence is illegally placed within the creek's designated flood boundary. According to County Ordinance 16.74, no permanent structure can be erected within 20 feet of the creek bank. The projector displayed the official map with the boundary clearly marked. That's outdated information, Patricia dismissed with a wave. The boundary was updated last year. Actually, it wasn't, came a voice from the back of the room. All heads turned to see Michael Rivera, the county inspector, who had slipped in quietly. The flood boundary designation remains unchanged since the development was built. And as of yesterday, the county has opened an official investigation into the unpermitted structure. Patricia's face flushed crimson. This is a personal vendetta. Thomas is trying to undermine my authority because he can't follow simple HOA guidelines. Is that why you paid Pinnacle Landscapes $4,200 from the HOA emergency fund without board approval? Asked Mrs. Johnson, who as treasurer had finally gained access to the accounts Patricia had been guarding. A murmur ran through the room. Several homeowners exchanged shocked glances. Patricia shot to her feet. That was authorized emergency maintenance. Moving someone's fence without permits isn't maintenance, it's vandalism, Thomas said calmly. And using HOA funds for personal projects is embezzlement. You can't prove anything, Patricia hissed, but Thomas could see the calculation in her eyes as she realized her position was weakening. Actually, Thomas continued, pulling out his phone, I've been documenting everything, including the fact that the shed, supposedly for community equipment, is currently storing your personal patio furniture set that matches the catalog I found in your recycling bin. He swiped through photos clearly showing the furniture visible through the shed window. The room erupted in angry voices. Board member Eliza Chen, who had remained silent until now, called for order. I move that we immediately restore Mr. Mitchell's fence to its original location and remove the shed from the creek boundary, she announced firmly. Patricia leaped to her feet again. I veto that motion as president. You can't veto a majority board decision, Eliza countered, as stated in our own bylaws, section 4.2. Fred, showing a rare moment of clarity, raised his hand tentatively. I second the motion to restore the fence. Patricia stared at him with naked betrayal. Fred, we discussed this. You discussed it, Fred muttered. My grandson helped me read the bylaws yesterday. What you did wasn't right, Patricia. The vote was called 4-1 to restore the fence, with only Patricia objecting. As the meeting broke up, Patricia cornered Thomas by the water cooler, her voice a venomous whisper. This isn't over. That fence stays where it is, and so does my shed. You think these people will stand up to me? They're sheep. By next week, they'll be back to worrying about their own violations. She straightened her jacket with a vicious tug. And your little victory tonight? It'll cost you. I've already filed a countersuit claiming emotional distress and defamation. How much did your lawyer friend say litigation would cost? $15,000. I hope you've been saving. Thomas watched her storm out, slamming the door hard enough to knock a framed copy of the HOA mission statement off the wall. The glass shattered on the linoleum floor, a fitting metaphor, Thomas thought, for what was happening to Patricia's carefully constructed facade of authority. The rain intensified as Thomas sat watching from his window, the steady drumbeat on his roof growing to a thunderous roar. Occasional lightning flashes illuminated the backyard in stark relief, showing the creek already beginning to swell beyond its normal boundaries. By 10 p.m., the water had risen 2 feet and was steadily creeping up the embankment. Thomas's phone lit up with a text from Marcus. Creek's rising fast. Johnson's basement already taking water. You okay over there? I'm fine, Thomas replied. High ground, remember? That's why I bought this lot. He didn't mention that Patricia's shed wasn't on high ground. That particular piece of information seemed prudent to keep to himself. Around 11 p.m., Thomas heard a vehicle splashing through the flooded street. He peeked through his blinds to see Patricia's SUV creeping along, headlights cutting through the downpour. She parked in her driveway and dashed through the rain to her front door, not even glancing toward the backyard or the creek. Interesting, Thomas murmured, came back to check on the house, but not the precious shed. Another emergency alert blared from his phone. Immediate evacuation order for homes on Creek Drive and Willow Lane. Creek levels rising rapidly. Seek higher ground immediately. Thomas's property was on Meadow Court, high enough to be safe, as he well knew from studying the topographical maps. Patricia's house was also on safe ground, but her shed stood directly in what was rapidly becoming the creek's new temporary boundary. Through the Rain Street window, Thomas could see Patricia's porch light come on. She emerged wearing what appeared to be designer rain boots and a yellow slicker, dragging a rolling suitcase behind her. She loaded it into her SUV and sped off without a backward glance at the shed. Running for higher ground without securing your unauthorized structure, Thomas whispered to himself, "That's just negligent." By midnight, the creek had transformed into a raging torrent. The water level had risen another 3 feet, now lapping at the edge of where Patricia's shed stood. Through his camera's night vision feature, Thomas could see the ground around the structure beginning to soften and erode. Thomas made himself another hot chocolate, sans bourbon this time, wanting to remain clear-headed, and continued his vigil. He heard sirens in the distance as emergency vehicles responded to flooding in lower-lying areas of the neighborhood. His phone buzzed with texts from concerned neighbors checking on each other. He responded to each one, careful to document his presence at home throughout the night. When Mrs. Johnson asked if he'd seen Patricia leave, he replied truthfully that he had observed her evacuating with a suitcase. At 12:47 a.m., he noticed the first significant movement. The shed shifted slightly, just an inch or two, as the water undercut one corner of its foundation. The loose blocks he'd adjusted earlier offered no resistance to the hungry current. "Physics is fascinating," Thomas commented to his empty living room. With each passing minute, the creek rose higher, and the ground became more saturated. The shed's tilting became more pronounced, first 5 degrees, then 10. Water began rushing underneath it, carrying away soil with increasing speed. Thomas checked his cameras again, ensuring they were still recording properly. One captured his front door, showing no movement. The other showed his property line and the creek beyond, with the shed now clearly at a precarious angle. Not a creature was stirring, Thomas recited quietly. Not even a homeowner tampering with an illegally placed structure. He settled deeper into his armchair, patiently waiting for nature to complete its work, a work that was now inevitable, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Thomas stood in disbelief as Patricia's words hung in the air between them. The 2 other board members mumbled excuses about another engagement and hurriedly gathered their purses and jackets, leaving Thomas alone with Patricia in her immaculate living room. "This isn't over," Thomas said, his voice low and controlled, despite the fury building inside him. "You can't just move someone's property line." Patricia sipped her tea with theatrical delicacy. "Oh, but I already have, and I should warn you." She leaned forward, dropping her voice to a stage whisper. "Filing a complaint against the HOA triggers an automatic comprehensive property audit. I'd hate to see what violations we might find if we look closely at your exterior lighting choices." Thomas's jaw clenched. Just last month, he'd installed subtle path lighting along his garden walkway. "You know what they say about picking your battles, Thomas," Patricia continued, checking her manicured nails. "Your fence was an eyesore anyway. The new placement is much more harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic." Outside, the construction crew was putting the finishing touches on the prefabricated shed. One worker was hammering a small brass plaque onto its door that read, "Property of Sunny Meadows, HOA, P. Wilkins, President." "You've had this planned for weeks," Thomas realized aloud. The survey, the bylaw citation, it was all just an excuse to put your shed where you wanted it. Patricia's smile resembled that of a satisfied cat. "I prefer to think of it as efficient community planning. The board identified a need for storage, and we found an appropriate location. The fact that it also resolves your encroachment is simply synergy." As Thomas turned to leave, Patricia called after him, "Oh, and the next HOA meeting is in 2 months. Feel free to add yourself to the agenda, though we only allow 3 minutes per complaint. Fred is very strict with the timer." Back at his house, Thomas surveyed the damage. Not only had his fence been moved, but the construction crew had trampled his vegetable garden and left deep tire tracks across his lawn. The new fence line cut directly through where his hammock had been strung between two trees, one of which was now outside his property. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Johnson. Just heard what happened. Coming over with a casserole and Fred's cousin, who works for the county permit office. 20 minutes later, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with Mrs. Johnson and Michael Rivera, a building inspector who examined the photos Thomas had taken. This is completely illegal, Michael confirmed, shaking his head. Moving a property boundary requires a formal survey, permission from both property owners, permits from the county, and usually a deed modification. What she's done is essentially theft of property. So I can report this? Thomas asked hopefully. Michael grimaced. You can, but here's where it gets complicated. The county will treat it as a civil dispute first. They'll tell you to resolve it through mediation or the courts, which costs money and takes forever. Mrs. Johnson added, serving Thomas another slice of her raspberry cheesecake. Exactly, Michael nodded. And in the meantime, Patricia's shed stays where it is, blocking your creek view and sitting on what should be your land. Thomas stared out his kitchen window at the beige monstrosity now dominating his sight line. Where once he could see the gentle curve of the creek and the weeping willow beyond, now there was only the shed's vinyl siding and a small window through which he could see Patricia arranging what looked like expensive garden furniture. There has to be something I can do, Thomas said, determination hardening in his voice. Mrs. Johnson patted his hand sympathetically. Everyone has a weakness, dear. Even Patricia Wilkins. You just need to find hers. Michael looked uncomfortable. As a county employee, I should remind you that any action you take should be strictly legal. He paused, then added quietly. That said, I couldn't help but notice that shed is sitting awfully close to the creek's flood boundary.